Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Levitsky. I am director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard, and welcome to one of our Tuesday webinars. I'm joined by my awesome co-chair, Professor Fran Hagopian. Hi. Today's panel is on the prospects for a way out of the Venezuelan crisis. As you all know, Venezuela has been a full-scale dictatorship for about a decade now. The last presidential election, 2018, I believe, was a total farce. And the 2024 elections also seem certain to be a farce. But then a couple of things happened over the last year. First, the United States and Venezuela began pretty serious negotiations into improving bilateral relations, which opened up a path to lifting sanctions, and that would potentially revive Venezuela's collapsed economy. And secondly, at the same time, Maria Corina Machado emerged as a broadly popular and very legitimate candidate for the opposition, winning a pretty remarkable primary process that was held several months ago. Machado was barred from running in the election, but until now, the United States, at least nominally, has conditioned the lifting of sanctions on steps towards a clean election in which she is allowed to participate. It is far, far from clear whether the Venezuelan government will ultimately accede to anything remotely like that. And in fact, in the last few weeks, it has dramatically increased repression against Venezuelan civil society. So the odds are not good. But the Maduro government is really weak. It is increasingly divided. And so there's at least a glimmer of hope for a transition that we have not seen in at least a few years. So to discuss this, I don't know if I should call it dynamic or potentially dynamic situation, we have brought four outstanding panelists. And I will just introduce all of them before we start, and then we'll go in alphabetical order by last name. And I'll introduce them in that order. First of all, Javier Corrales is well known to those of us in the doctoral class community. He is Dwight W. Morrow, 1895, professor of political science at Amherst College. Professor Corrales holds a PhD from the Harvard Government Department, and he's researched and published on a very wide range of issues, including the politics of economic reform, politics of constitutional reform, politics of LGBTQ rights in Latin America, and very prominently, the rise of autocracy in Venezuela. Among several other books, Professor Corrales is co-author of the great book, Dragon in the Tropics, Venezuela and the Legacy of Hugo Chavez, and then more recently, of autocracy rising, Venezuela's transition to authoritarianism. Welcome and thank you, Javier. Secondly, Sam Handlin is Associate Professor of Political Science at Swarthmore College. He is a card-carrying member of the Berkeley Mafia and has done path-breaking research on state weakness, polarization, and populism in Latin America. He's author of a terrific book entitled State Crisis and Fragile Democracies, Polarization and Political Regimes in South America. That was published in 2017 by Cambridge University Press. He's also co-editor with Ruth Behrens Collier of Reorganizing Popular Politics, Participation in the New Interest Regime in Latin America. Professor Handlin is currently working on a book on the role of secret police and digital surveillance technologies under Venezuela's contemporary dictatorship. That sounds like an easy topic to research. Welcome, Sam. Thanks for coming. Third, Maryhen Jiménez is, I cannot pronounce this name, Marie Skłodowska. Help me on this. I'm not going to try again. Curie, Global Fellow, University of Oxford. Dr. Jiménez obtained her PhD in politics in 2020, University of Oxford, where she wrote an award-winning dissertation. Her research spans the field of comparative authoritarianism and democratization, with a particular focus on opposition parties. Welcome and thanks for joining us, Maryhen. And finally, an old friend, Francisco Monaldi, is director of the Latin American Energy Program and a fellow at the Center for Energy Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. He's also a lecturer in the economics department at Rice. A PhD from Stanford University, Dr. Monaldi is an expert on the politics of energy and energy policy, with a particular, although not exclusive, expertise on its home country of Venezuela. Welcome back, Francisco. I will just a couple of quick housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar as always today. That will be available via our YouTube channel, the Dr. Vets YouTube channel, not long after the session. And if you want access to the video, you can also write us. And secondly, and importantly, if you've got questions for the panelists, please send those questions through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And you should feel free to send questions at any point during the panel. You don't have to wait until the end. I will do my best to incorporate as many questions, remote questions, as I can. We've asked each of our panelists to speak for about 12 minutes, and that should hopefully leave us with 35 minutes or so for discussion and Q&A at the end. Again, I'll take questions both from the in-house audience and from the online audience. And we will close right at 1:20 because I got to go teach. All right, so we begin with Javier. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Steve, thank you so much. Alicia, Fran, everyone who's listening at Harvard or online. Thank you for having me. A pleasure to be here. I feel honored to be next to Francisco, Sam, and Maryhen. They're, the best thinkers on these subjects. So what I thought I would do today is I posted a little tweet on X, former Twitter, that I want to explain. I didn't get the chance to explain it. I want to expand it. And that posting was the following. What happened to Maduro after the Barbados Agreement? And I said during that post that he experienced what I call an Amazon return moment. We bought a buyer's remorse. He bought something on Amazon and tried it on and decided, I'm not going to take it. I am going to send it back. The Maduro government, what he was buying with the Barbados Agreement, which was an agreement with the opposition, but it was really an agreement to improve relations with the United States. That's what he was buying. He made the purchase, he signed the agreement. It meant that he needed to conduct free and fair elections. And then he tried it on. He allowed the primaries to take place. The primaries occurred. And then he didn't like the results of the primary. He didn't like what the new regime looked like. And he's now in the process of sending this back, rejecting every aspect of the Barbados Agreement, at least the most fundamental aspects, by reaffirming the ban on María Corina Machado, the harassment of the leading parties, and a huge crackdown. If we could even speak of intensifying terror in a very terror-oriented regime, we're seeing it right now. So I want to talk about why, what happened here, what produced this buyer's remorse. First, let me begin by saying I'm probably sure that this is not going to be that original, that I'm guessing many people will agree with this. The primaries shocked not just María Corina Machado, who was the leading vote getter, but Maduro government as well. And this is what the shock was about. Maduro was thinking that the only way that he could confront an election in Venezuela is that if he faced an opposition that had the following characteristics. It needed to be divided, possibly among various groups. So a divided opposition led by mostly weak candidates and with a high degree of abstentionism. This is the 2018 model. This is how he competes. What the primary showed is that he couldn't get that opposition. María Corina Machado unified the opposition. María Corina Machado was now mobilizing in favor of voting rather than abstention, and that she was not a weak candidate. So unable to have the opposition that Maduro wanted, his remorse began. The primary, I think, played a big role. Maybe there were other factors, but it really, really surprised the difficulty that he knew he was going to face. I do think that Maduro feels that if you get the kind of opposition that he has in mind, and again, let me repeat the model, weak political candidates, a divided opposition, and a high degree of abstention, then he might be able to somehow prevail with other things in mind. but that scenario was upended by the primaries. Now, let me also say one thing. So as close observers may know, the decision to renege on the Barbados Agreement, to me, is very obvious. I don't think there is any sort of like in between. If the United States doesn't want to recognize this as breaking the agreement, that's the United States prerogative. But it's very clear that everything is being violated given the response to the political systems that we have seen since then. But close observers can say, well, he's still thinking of an election. This is absolutely true. And we just saw Jorge Rodriguez announce the new agreement of what the election is going to be. So let me just now say, spend my last 2 or 3 minutes in order to give time for others. How then is Maduro thinking about the election? So I already spoke about how he imagines the opposition is going to look like. But now let me say how the government is going to appear. What is going to be the profile of the government? And I want to say the following. So what we're seeing here is that Maduro's electoral cocktail, the blend of ingredients that he's going to put into the campaign, are very similar to those that we had under Chavez, but the proportions are going to be very different this time around. So the Chavez classic drink, electoral drink cocktail, this is the recipe as I saw it. You have a heavy dose of state spending, a medium dose of electoral irregularities, and a pinch of repression. Okay, so that's kind of like the ingredients. There was also, of course, all the anti-imperialist discourse, all of that. But to me, the 3 key ingredients were, again, a heavy dose of state spending, a medium dose of electoral irregularities, and a pinch of repression. So what Maduro, I think, is going to do coming to this election is change the proportions. So instead of a pinch of repression, a heavy dose of repression. Also a heavy dose of electoral irregularities. He already did this starting in 2017 when he basically made the 2 decisions in 2016, 2017, more or less, repress the recall referendum initiative, repress and undo the parliament and go after political parties. And a pinch of social spending. So a little bit only of social spending. Precisely because he now estimates that his electoral cocktail only requires a pinch of social spending, it makes it easier for him to return this package back to Amazon. I think he realized that the lure of stronger relations with the United States and therefore easing the sanctions was that easing sanctions would somehow generate more money for the government to compete. But once he made the determination that his electoral cocktail only requires a pinch of social spending, then it's easier for him to say, I can send this package back to sender. And so that's where I see the situation at the moment. I have to say that Maduro has been enormously successful in producing the kind of opposition that he's always dreamed of. Again, a lot of divisions with a high degree, with weak politicians competing against him and a high level of abstention. So I would imagine that we're going to see elections this year with those particular features. So thank you very much. Those were my comments on to whoever comes next. Who's
Thanks, Javier.
Sam? Yeah, thank you.
Sam is
Sam.
next.
Great. Okay, so well, thank you, Steve and Fran and everyone else for inviting me to offer my thoughts, which will really sort of build on Javier's, I guess. Really, I want to kind of focus on a few aspects of the strategic quandary faced by the regime in this election. You know, as sort of Javier alluded to, the Maduro government would ideally like to have their cake and eat it too. Their first priority is to hold on to power, but they've sort of had this idea that they could possibly get some relief from economic sanctions and kind of rebuild their international standing if they held a more competitive election. And so I think this is like sort of a classic balancing act for electoral authoritarian regimes. You want to hold an election that is just free and competitive enough to generate legitimacy, but not fair enough to allow the opposition to win. And so this is the sort of standard type of balancing act that folks like Steve and many others have written about extensively. What I think is really unusual and bears some dwelling upon is the degree of difficulty of the calculation that the Maduro government faces in terms of calibrating how much they would need to tilt the playing field against the opposition and how to do it. In a lot of cases, electoral authoritarian regimes actually have a pretty good sense of this calculation. They have a substantial electoral base to mobilize. They have a good understanding of the size and nature of the electorate, and they have sort of established strategies, the sort of established cocktail that Javier referred to. And so, in any given election, it's sort of a matter of kind of adjusting the dial up or down a bit. And I would argue that was the case for much of the Chavez era. In this situation, however, I don't think the Maduro government actually knows what it needs to do to win an election the opposition fully contests. For one, I mean, basically post-2013, they just never done it successfully. There is no successful model for them. The one time they actually tried to have a reasonably free and competitive election, they badly miscalculated the electorate, and the opposition won the 2015 legislative elections. So really, they're kind of a closed regime holding elections, and the question is whether they can sort of pull off a transition to sort of a competitive authoritarian regime. And in 2024, there are just a number of contextual factors by this point that I think this make it a particularly hard calculation and a particularly difficult transition. So the first I would point to is that it's just really hard to predict the size and composition of the 2024 electorate. I mean, it's been 9 years since there was a fully contested election. So many Venezuelans have left the country since then, and it's hard to predict how many will end up voting for like all sorts of different reasons. And so you had an electorate of about 15 million in 2013 and 2015, and about 9 million in the sort of sham election of 2018, and also in the regional elections of 2021. And so if there's sort of a reasonably fair election in 2024, even if or a reasonably free election, even if it's deeply unfair, turnout is going to fall between those two numbers. But that's a huge range between 9 million and 15 million. And the size of that range introduces a lot of uncertainty in terms of thinking about how many votes the regime needs to mobilize to win. The second point I would make is I think the regime is very likely deeply unsure about its own ability to mobilize those votes for a number of reasons. First of all, they've just really lost their social base with a much higher reliance on clientelism, threats, and other sort of instrumental tools vis-a-vis loyalty and partisanship. And so that makes it harder to predict your ability to mobilize votes, not only because people may not vote without a material inducement, but also because those Venezuelans telling the regime they're loyalists may be falsifying their preferences. In other words, they may be feigning support for the regime in order to receive a cash payment or keep their job, but planning to defect in the privacy of the voting booth if they believe the opposition can win and that the vote is secret. And then finally, even beyond these issues, I think it's really hard to know what the PSUV's grassroots mobilizing capability looks like on an operational level across the country. So Chavismo has traditionally really relied on sort of rural and far-flung areas as electoral bases, kind of just like running up huge margins in some of these communities. And these are the same areas where the authority of the state itself has been sort of challenged and broken down in the last 5 years. And so how effectively a local political machine operates in that context is very hard to know, especially as local PSUV leaders and politicians may have incentives to sort of exaggerate their own ability to mobilize support. And the last point to make here is, which really relates to both the uncertainties about the size of the electorate and the regime's ability to mobilize support, is that polling is just really difficult in the country and not really an informational solution to these issues. So polls in 2018 and 2021 were poor, significantly overestimated the opposition. And so, recent polls show Maduro getting killed, but it's hard for the regime to know exactly what to make of that. So I have kind of three implications to draw out, which I call the good, the bad, and the ugly, which will go in reverse order. So the ugly is really that the regime's kind of anxiety and uncertainty is likely a big factor contributing to the chaotic and unpredictable nature of the election's kind of scheduling and administration. And I think there's this sort of temptation to read every decision by the regime as part of some kind of master plan to manipulate the situation or drive wedges within the opposition, but it's really also a product of their own insecurity and anxiety, which aren't going to go away. The bad is that I think there's a legitimate chance that the regime, facing so much uncertainty, ultimately just decides to err on the side of caution and either cancel the election or engage in like really heavy-handed repression, kind of exactly the sort of cocktail element that Javier mentioned, that makes the election essentially unfree. And I don't think we can rule that out, unfortunately. It would obviously be a very bad outcome. The good is that if the regime does go ahead with an election that is essentially free, even if deeply unfair, and the opposition stays reasonably united and committed, then I think there is like a pretty good chance that the regime miscalculates what it needs to do to win. Maybe even to the point where it either loses or has to engage in some kind of blatant last-minute fraud that precipitates a crisis that they may not be able to manage. I wouldn't necessarily predict that, but I wouldn't rule it out. Miscalculation has been an important element of many dictators falling at the ballot box. And there's just a lot of variables kind of favoring the possibility of miscalculation in this case, if there is sort of a reasonably real election. So the last thing I just wanted to say in conclusion is just sort of to take up the question of whether the opposition could take actions that increase the likelihood of miscalculation. And I'll leave most of the talking about the opposition to Maryhen, who is the expert on this subject, but just sort of two observations in this regard. The first one is that, to me, the opposition really should make it a priority to do everything possible to protect the secret ballot and give people confidence in the secrecy of the ballot. It is a big source of miscalculation, involves the regime thinking people are loyalists who end up voting differently. And for that to happen, you need people to have confidence to express their true preferences at the ballot box. They need to really feel comfortable with the secret ballot. The second observation is that, there's a big possibility of miscalculation, but you don't want the regime to miscalculate to the sort of conservative side and engage in more repression than they need. So, you want them to miscalculate in the opposite direction and sort of underestimate the amount of illiberalism and repression that would be necessary. And so I think this poses a bit of a tricky dilemma for the opposition that I don't have a solution to, but is sort of worth highlighting, which is that in general, in electoral authoritarian regimes, a big challenge for the opposition is simply convincing the electorate that they can win. People are disillusioned, they think the system is rigged, and you need to get them to the polls. And so the problem is that the more convincing you sound about your chance of winning, the more likely you might be to convince the regime to suspend the election or escalate repression to the point where the election is no longer free. So I think there is a bit of a conundrum there. And maybe the answer, I don't know, is to be sort of coy about your chances until the election gets close enough that the sort of costs of canceling it or sharply escalating repression become increasingly high. So overall, I can't say that I'm optimistic, but I do retain some hope that even if the election is deeply unfair, as long as we have an election where people are free to vote, anything can happen.
Thanks, Sam. Our third speaker is Maryhen Jiménez.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be here. I'm gonna use the little time that we have to jump right in, and Javier's and Sam's presentations were great in laying sort of the ground of what we're going to see this year. So what I want to do is just a few thoughts very briefly on the current context and the government, sort of expanding on what's already been said, and then focus on what I study, which is the opposition, and then a final comment on civil society and the role that civil society is playing in Venezuela these days. So we have Venezuela today as a highly fragmented country. Repression, censorship, economic decline, inequality has fragmented society into different camps. So ordinary citizens on their daily day-to-day, they're looking to get by and are quietly waiting for the presidential elections to happen this year. When I say quietly, it's because even though the primary took place last year and there was great mobilization, and even though there is mobilization basically in Venezuela every day, the mobilization we've seen over the last year focused a little more on social, economic, cultural rights than civil and political, right? And that might be a response to the increased repression that we have seen under the Maduro government. But that doesn't mean that civil and political rights don't matter anymore to the population. And what it means is that people are kind of quietly waiting for that window of opportunity to show up to then express or hopefully express what they think. In any case, all of the recent polls show that Venezuelans want to vote, and I'll make a comment on this later on. So at the same time, we have a government that is in a very uncertain and tough situation, as Javier and Sam have already explained. It's electorally weak. Let's remember that Chavismo used to be a mass movement. It no longer is a mass movement. And so being voted out of office would imply not being voted back for a long while or at all. And that's obviously very risky. Moreover, the government has a highly unpopular candidate. Morrow polls around has an 80% rejection rate quite constantly. So they're in a real dilemma in terms of the future of Chavismo, the future of the ruling coalition. Then something we haven't spoken about so much is the grant corruption and human rights violations. Venezuela is the only country in Latin America that has an open investigation in front of the International Criminal Court. There is a UN fact-finding mission. The Inter-American system has also recorded massive human rights violations, as well as other international and domestic human rights organizations. So the stakes are very high. And all of this creates a very complicated situation where holding competitive elections would probably lead to losing. And obviously, as we've discussed so far, that's not the first option for the government. Now, how does the world of opposition look like in Venezuela? I will paint a more complex picture. Sorry for that, but it's not a black and white situation. So who is the opposition in Venezuela? Yeah. The anti-Chavista camp or anti-regime camp or anti-government camp is very broad, right? It ranges from the left to the right. There are partisan and non-partisan groups. There are also some groups more committed to democracy and liberal democracy than others. Some have a greater organizational capacity than others. And I see Laura in the audience. Some have insisted in more, institutional moderate strategies, and others have had a strategic preference along more top-down, extra-institutional strategies for regime change. So it's not a homogeneous group whatsoever. What usually people associate with the term the opposition is the traditional opposition inside and in exile now, and it comprises the most important parties. These parties are now mostly organized in the Plataforma Unitaria, which is the splintered coalition of the Mesa de la Unidad Democrática, but without its strength and kind of internal rules. It's important to say that the Plataforma is kind of the counterpart in the negotiation process with the government. At the same time, there are other growing groups that are anti-government, but do not necessarily belong to the traditional opposition, such as dissidents or defector movements. And so they criticize both the government, but also to some extent, some groups within the traditional opposition. I think it's interesting to look, for example, at the Communist Party that broke away several years ago and is now quite a strong critic of the Maduro regime. And then a new phenomenon has emerged under Maduro particularly, or has, by design in a way, which is a formally non-regime opposition, but it's a co-opted group of people that now play under the rules of the Maduro government. So these people are not interested, obviously, in regime change, but rather in a continuation of the status quo, given that they have received privileges and benefits. So being aware of these differences is important because, as we know, coordination of anti-regime forces are important vis-a-vis an electoral process, for example. But coalescing will be difficult. I don't think that the opposition gets unified. I think that it will be also very difficult to unify vis-a-vis the next elections. And my work on coordination and the effects of repression on coordination shows that the government has weakened traditional actors and fragmented them both through high repression, but also particularly through selective repression. So by design, it's going to be very difficult at this point to coordinate. Additionally, the opposition has engaged in a strategic zigzag that has weakened its internal position vis-a-vis the government. Sometimes it participated in elections, sometimes it has boycotted elections. And there has also been an idea among some groups that regime change could come about through protests and or external pressure, for example, sanctions. And finally, I think it's also important to highlight that the so-called interim government created or added more dilemmas to the world of the traditional opposition as well. Particularly, it didn't leave any relevant organizational capacity and or strategic path about how to proceed. Now, what are we going to see in 2024? The opposition is back to, let's say, maybe square one. It has decided that it will participate in the presidential elections and it held a primary last year, La Plataforma Unitaria, to select a joint candidate. María Corina Machado, a former hardliner, won the primary by a landslide. Now, she will face several challenges, or is already facing several challenges for the time being. So how can she become a credible partner or coalition builder, if you want, vis-a-vis the rest of the opposition? Having been a hardliner helped her in the past, but now there's some issues for her to deal with. In the past, she was a harsh critic of left-leaning parties. She believed for a long time that socialism is the real malaise in Venezuela. And also she was a critic of the interim government. So I think that some questions remain. Will she have the strategic preference to build a broad coalition where all coalition partners can contribute and benefit from? Say maybe the model of la Mesa de la Unidad Democrática? Or does she want to displace opposition players and the government at the same time? So the question is, what type of coalition will she want to craft? One that evolves around her, so a more personalistic mechanism, or one around clear decision-making rules and conflict resolution mechanisms with the capacity to outlive her. And that's important because coordination before and after elections are really important, right? We know that already from other cases. So in the event of winning, if the opposition fragments quickly after that electoral success, it'll be very difficult to govern. Also, let's not forget that in 2025, legislative and local and regional elections will take place. So coordination efforts should also kind of boost the opposition's capacity also regarding the future. And the big question for me is also whether she'll be able to craft a different coalition that goes beyond incorporating political actors to include or have a better coordination with social actors as well. And that's important because Venezuelan politics is very hierarchical, right? Politicians believe that politics is only up to them, not to society. So I think that here, María Corina, coming from civil society herself, has a potential to kind of shuffle up the way that opposition politics has been conducted over the past decade or so, or even more. And I think also a big question for her is how to keep momentum, right? Venezuelans want to vote. A recent poll shows that 53% would vote for any unitary candidate, and 70% would encourage María Corina to find an alternative candidate if she's not allowed to run. So the question is, what will she do with that reality? I'm not saying she should be publicly speaking about an alternative strategy, but there is something to be dealt with, the dilemma that is being imposed by this authoritarian context. And just a final thought on civil society. So in the face of the decline of political parties because of repression and several other variables and explanations, civil society actors have emerged stronger in Venezuela. According to the same poll by Dating Corp, at least 89% distrust political parties. More than 45% identifies as independent, only 15% identifies with the ruling party, and only 14% with María Corina's party. So in this context, we've seen that repression has increased towards civil society, particularly non-partisan actors, as they have become more relevant in helping vulnerable groups and mobilizing around important issues, like I mentioned before, for example, access to water, access to food, or labor rights. So civil society actors have, over the years, built internal and external networks and have increased their capacity to help local communities and also in denouncing human rights violations. So the government now fears that these actors that have gained legitimacy and to some extent also representation will mobilize for the 2024 election and will therefore target activists and other credible actors even more. And we've seen this over the past weeks. The case of Rocío San Miguel is one example of this. So all of this is obviously to intimidate, demobilize, and demoralize the opposition and society more broadly. So I want to end with an idea or a thought about, is there a prospect for a way out in Venezuela? We've all been kind of not negative, but quite realistic about the situation on the ground. I think that, many overlook or maybe not aware of the interesting and courageous developments on the ground in Venezuela. There are cultural groups, environmentalists, feminists, unionists, humanitarian organizations who every day work to organize society and to alleviate human suffering. So obviously some might believe that that's not sufficient or that's not relevant. But what I have found in my research is that local actors are very important to local communities. What I find is that this type of activism matters a lot, particularly in the short term. Of course, people are aware in those communities that these efforts are not destined to ousting Maduro necessarily. But this activism matters in several other ways. So I think that there's some hope for the future, particularly when we take a look at hidden or unexpected places of active and meaningful resistance. But whether that will lead towards regime change this year, only time will tell. Thank you.
Thanks. And hitting cleanup, Francisco Monaldi.
Sure, thank you very much. Let me share with you some slides that I think will be helpful to illustrate some points. But before showing you the slides, I just wanted to mention two things about the previous interventions that I think were all great and tremendously illuminating. I wanted to sort of emphasize some elements of the cocktail that Javier mentioned, which are, and were mentioned by Sam and Maryhen, which are that the government, one of the strategies has always been promoting abstention and using that also to divide the opposition, which is another of the strategies, of course, that Maryhen has described so well. And the other one is sort of hinting that the vote is not secret, as Sam said, that has been also a very useful strategy. And in terms of the government making a miscalculation, one of the concerns I have is that they already made an early miscalculation, which was the primaries of the opposition that they thought will be much less successful, and also a miscalculation with the referendum on the Essequibo that was a failure in terms of their mobilization. And unfortunately, I think those two elements, plus the very facts on the ground that María Corina Machado heads the polls with such a big margin, even with a high abstention rate scenario, which I think that's the important thing to keep in mind. That makes it problematic. But let me go now to the other side of the picture, which is what has the U.S. used as a leverage to negotiate with Maduro. And here, just to do a little bit of background, the U.S. started imposing first individual sanctions with the Obama administration, but then the sectoral sanctions and oil sanctions during the Trump administration that escalated from financial sanctions to closing the U.S. market and not allowing also American companies to export to Venezuela refined products. Then in 2020, secondary sanctions to Rosneft, the Russian oil company, which was marketing half of Venezuelan oil, which was, of course, also the year of COVID. So it was a disaster for Venezuela, and production went down as low as 350,000 barrels. From a peak of 3.4 million barrels before Chavez came in, so almost 10% of the level of production at its peak. Then in 2022, after the invasion of Russia to Ukraine, the negotiations were established between Venezuela and Maduro, between the U.S. and Maduro, when the visit of Juan González to Caracas sort of opened up that negotiation. And the negotiation had a sort of two elements. I mean, on the one hand, the U.S., the Biden administration felt that the policies of the Trump administration had been failures, and this situation in Ukraine offered an opening for the Biden administration and for Juan González to do a shift in policy. On the other hand, Maduro realized by that point that even though oil production had recovered, there was no more possibility of recovering even further without massive investment, and that required some sanctions relief. And so that opened up the negotiation for first a license to Chevron that is allowed to PDVSA sign a new contract with Chevron that gives Chevron tons of prerogatives and to do the things that in the past had basically made them not be attracted to invest in Venezuela. And on the other hand, it opened the U.S. market and allowed Chevron to get the massive debt that PDVSA has with them to get it paid off. Also, Eni and Repsol were allowed to do some swaps of oil for refined products and to pay debt. But eventually, the Barbados, sort of the negotiation that started in Doha and sort of culminated with the Barbados agreement, basically the U.S. offered in exchange the General License 44 that basically suspends oil sanctions until April 18th, and with the exception of sanctions to Russian companies operating in Venezuela. And also, Shell obtained a license with Trinidad to export gas to Trinidad, and other licenses are being negotiated, or are being applications for by Repsol and Morel and Prom, which are two European companies. And here you can see how the oil production in Venezuela has been declining since about when Maduro came into power in 2013, from about 2.8 million barrels to an average minimum of 569 in 2020. And U.S. sanctions clearly played a role, but most of the role was played by the policies implemented by the government. There has been some recovery despite the sanctions continuing in 2021. And then, of course, with Chevron's license, some additional recovery. But notice that the responsibility of sanctions is limited with respect to the massive counterfactual would be Venezuelan producing similar levels to the other OPEC countries. Sanctions started much later than the sort of the underperformance of Venezuela. And recently there has been some recovery, but as you can see, most of the recovery occurred in 2020 and 2021, and was the result of what you see here. Basically, Venezuela had tons of spare capacity because during COVID, they were unable to sell because of the combination of the decline in the price of oil and the secondary sanctions. It wasn't until the price recovered and Iran helped Venezuela to get into the black market in China and helped Venezuela by sending them diluents for the extra heavy oil that they recovered. But notice then that the spare capacity disappeared. So Maduro knew by the end of 2021 that he needed a lot of investment and sanctions relief to get further. Here you see Venezuela has 2 oil rigs in operation after having around 70 during the Chavismo on average. Without oil rigs drilling new wells, production is not going to go up in Venezuela. And so that's the sort of the rationale for why Maduro wanted this. I just wanted to very quickly go over why the U.S. changed policy. I already mentioned that they didn't think that the maximum pressure policy of Trump worked out. They wanted to change policy from day one, but they were given the opening with the geopolitics of energy, Ukraine invasion. Of course, the immigration crisis has become a more relevant part lately because of the massive influx of Venezuelans through the southern border of the U.S. and the fact that the U.S. wanted to get flights to repatriate Venezuelans that were not given asylum to the U.S. Also, the Florida politics, Cuban-American politics, declining in importance because the Republicans basically are now winning easily Florida. And also Senator Menendez is out of the picture, which was a hawk on the Democratic side. So all these things open up sort of the space for a much more negotiated sort of sanctions relief. Also the changes in Latin America and the change from, you had Piñera, you had Duque, you had Macri at some point, and in Peru, sort of the center-right governing, then all of a sudden you have a very different environment right now. And we can give for the questions, what will happen with Trump. But just let me tell you that the important thing in terms of sanction relief, in terms of investment, have been the licenses to a specific companies, particularly to Chevron. That is where the action is. The other 2 big players, which are the Russians and the Chinese, are not significantly increasing production in Venezuela or investment. The other actors have a much smaller role, which are the Europeans and the Indians. There's going to be some increase in the European companies if they get specific licenses, but not because of the general license, at least so far. And here is sort of an estimate of what might happen if sanctions relief continues. So if in April the license 44 continues, I am not discarding that scenario despite of Javier's very well established set of why Maduro is not complying with the Barbados Agreement, because I think the US might renew at least partially this license if Maduro sort of does the minimum before April 18th in terms of the Barbados agreement. And I think he might still do it, but perhaps it doesn't happen. In that case, we will still see some increase in production because of the specific licenses, but eventually production will start to decline. I mean, if there is no normalization of relations between the US and Venezuela and a complete lift of sanctions, there is not going to be a full recovery of the oil sector. I will not go into the details of why GL-44 has benefited Maduro, but less than we all expected, because the discount that Venezuela is having to give in order to sell oil have been reduced, but not as much as we thought, because basically still PDVSA is not selling any oil in the US. It's just Chevron selling it. And that's because of sort of the over compliance regarding sanctions. But bottom line, now Venezuela is exporting to India instead of the black market in China, and to China in the formal market part of it. Still, there is some Venezuelan oil going to the black market, particularly the one being produced by Russian companies in Venezuela. So Maduro is not getting as much money as we thought. He's going to get about $2 billion on top of the about $10 billion that he was getting if the license is not renewed, and perhaps $5 billion if he gets the license for the whole year. So that is in part one of the reasons why Maduro is less happy with the Amazon delivery, because he's not getting as much benefits from it. And of course, because the risk, as my predecessors explained, are much higher. So you can see here that after the license, we can see a lot of more oil flowing to India, and we can expect that to continue until April, a very significant increase in the oil sent to India to get a better pay. And so with that, I just want to close by saying that I do have the similar pessimism than my colleagues, because I think that for Maduro, even though the incentives to get sanctions relief are there, they are less significant than we thought. And the other issue is that the risk for complying with the Barbados Agreement in any meaningful way are very, very significant. Thank you.
Thanks to all four. We've got about half an hour for questions. I'll start in the room.
Yeah, I actually got two questions. One is, what is the role of the diaspora and how hard is it to vote if you're not in Venezuela? And the second question is, three of you mentioned the word repression, but what is repression in Venezuela? How does it look?
Why don't we go, not everyone has to answer the question, but we'll just go in order of a presentation. So Javier, you want to take a crack?
I don't have precise details about your first question, how hard it will be for the diaspora to vote. My guess is that it's going to be incredibly hard, and there may not be that much interest to vote abroad. But on the repression, let's be very, Maryhen already mentioned this, but, Venezuela has a publicly declared torture center, as well as many others, El Helicoide. Venezuela arrests people in their homes. They don't just arrest people who are outside protesting and causing trouble. They go into people's homes. They have two intelligence services, one to spy on citizens, and another one to spy on the military, which is the height of repression, and a lot of the repression goes to the military. The Venezuelan government is well known for its ability to deny social services and jobs and opportunities to people who are seen as dangers to the regime. And so we really have here there's the argument that in the study of authoritarianism, terror is going down as one of the tactics, but in Venezuela it's going up. It is equivalent to what we saw during the military junta, and it's because this is a military junta. One more thing about repression in Venezuela. Venezuela is well known worldwide for engaging of privatizing the repression. A lot of the repression is done by uniformed government agents or undercover government agents, but a lot of the repression is also privatized to what are called colectivos and actors who can engage in plausible deniability. And those are incredibly well organized, produce quite a bit of harassment, and operate with a significant degree of impunity. So it is really not on. It's important that this is a very important question. This is a regime of terror, and they may increase it or lower it, but they don't seem to be willing to give that up as an instrument of governance.
Thanks. Sam? Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, I just can offer a couple thoughts on that, on the two questions. So just in terms of the diaspora, I don't, some of this I feel like I don't completely understand, but my understanding is that for the primaries, they essentially instituted a policy where people who had been registered, were already in the electoral rolls as of like 2022, were allowed to vote as long as they took the active step to changed their area of residence officially from inside Venezuela to outside, and then the further active step to actually figure out the logistics of voting wherever they were. And that I think something like around 400,000 people abroad voted. So not a small number, but also not a very high percentage of Venezuelans living abroad at this point. So what that means for the general election, I'm not really sure. Yeah, I would kind of get, I guess I would just make 2 points. One, there's probably, this is probably something that the regime can contest, what the rules are for those people voting. It'll be an aspect of trying to tilt the playing field, is maybe to change those rules or use those rules. But I think it's like a substantial number, but not a massive one in terms of how many votes we can expect to come from abroad is my guess. As far as repression, I think I would agree with the points that Javier made in general. The only thing I would say is that I think vis-a-vis a lot of other authoritarian regimes, Venezuela's its intelligence services have been largely sort of surveillance agencies and sort of informational tools more than wielders of violence. I mean, there has been certainly violent repression and continues to be violent repression. There's all sorts of things written about it. But in terms of the scale, we're not talking about like massive levels of repression, of violent repression by those agencies. That probably more violent repression has been wielded by either private entities like Javier mentioned, or basically like police forces that are engaging in repression, not necessarily for overtly political reasons or clearly like national level political reasons. So, I mean, the biggest thing in Venezuela has just been extrajudicial killings by the police. And so we just haven't really seen the regime engage in large-scale violent repression in the context of an election, but there are these sort of elements there that could be brought to bear in pretty scary ways if the regime decided to do that. And so I think that's a scary possibility.
I want to give all the panelists a chance to respond. Remember, you don't have to respond to all the questions, Maryhen, and then
yeah, very briefly. So I think that the diaspora will play a role in mobilizing before the elections. But yeah, as Sam and Javier also said, we don't know how many people will really be able to vote. I think it's also interesting to look at where diaspora communities are most organized. So it's probably in Bogota and some cities in the U.S. and Madrid. So we have seen concentrations and small protests in favor, of Maria Corina after the primaries. Obviously, those have gone down, but I expect that there will be some mobilization this year across Europe and also in the U.S. and Latin America. Javier, I thought you were going to talk about autocratic legalism, but you didn't. So I think it's important to highlight that there are nonviolent and violent mechanisms of repression, right? I think that both are being applied in Venezuela. There's massive censorship and self-censorship, for example. So people have difficulties getting access to quality information. For example, as we discussed, journalists are sent into exile. They're threatened. Civil society actors as well. So it's very the overall environment about basic freedoms are very obviously curtailed. I also think that state violence is increasing, and it has been increasing in communities, and it's going to increase towards the election date. It's probably going to be the second semester of this year. And the extrajudicial killings are obviously, those are repressive measures and they are politically motivated, right? So, for example, the FARC, these were security forces that were built to deliberately kill young men between 15 and 35. So I think that those resources are there to be used in case it's needed, but also Sam has a good point in saying that you don't see it on a daily life, on a day-to-day basis, when you're, for example, in Caracas, right? I mean, Maduro, for example, we haven't talked about this. The government has implemented an important campaign with TikTokers and social media, etc., to paint a picture that Venezuela has been fixed. That Venezuela is, is like any other country in Latin America. And so in those pictures, you won't see, Venezuela highly militarized. But if you look a little deeper, you will see those forces there and ready to work if needed.
Let's go.
I just wanted to mention that I think it's very important to understand first that the vote in the primaries was organized by the opposition, not by the Electoral Council, and therefore the people who voted will not be able to, many of them will not be able to vote in the elections. First, because in the US there will be no polling stations because there are no diplomatic relations. Second, because a lot of the people who register for the primaries of the opposition will not be able to register for the elections. So the participation of the diaspora will be minimal in the elections, will only in a very, very close result would have any relevance. That doesn't mean that they could have, other roles in terms of, funding the opposition or organizing, but it's not in terms of votes. It will not be relevant. There are 8 million Venezuelans, according to the UN, outside of Venezuela, out of about 33 million, and the vast majority will not be able to participate because the Electoral Council is not making it easy for them to do it. It's making it actually very, very, very hard. Thank you.
I'm going to take one more round of in-house questions. Let me ask each questioner to be as concise as possible, and also panelists, pick and choose the answers you want. Don't feel the need to answer them all. So we'll start with Claudia Lopez.
Thank you. I want to ask you about how the chances of the opposition you look for the next election, because it seems to me that many literature criticizes opposition before because they weren't unified, they weren't organized, they weren't sure of using only institutional and not extra institutional mechanisms. But if you look at the primary, well, that's exactly what they were trying to do. Organize, unify, follow the institutional mechanism rather than extra institutional. But now if they concede to Maduro to choose a different candidate than the one who won the primary, which is Maryhen, that would be a call for division, or picking exactly the weakest candidate that probably Maduro want to confront, rather than a unified and legitimate candidate. So I don't know to what extent that will be sort of conceding to what our panelist was calling the recipe, the perfect recipe to keep in power so-called legitimacy, or if they keep following their strategy, even if they don't have a fair election, but they keep pushing Maduro's regime sort of to the clear edge of authoritarianism.
Okay, Laura, speaking of opposition.
So I think my first question was in line with Claudia's, which is, what is a reasonable goal? I don't think the opposition is going to win the next elections. I don't see that happening. But what is a reasonable goal for those elections, right? If the opposition participates, what would be a win, even a small one? And the second question is mostly for Maryhen. I was thinking about what is the relationship of these civil society groups with the government? My sense is that they would be kind of staying away from the government because they need to do their work, and for that they need to not piss people off. And can they be leveraged to create a more grassroots movement, right? Like thinking about a long-term strategy.
Question over here on the one.
Hey, thank you for being here. My question, complementing Major Lopez's question, is who could be María Corina Machado's replacement? Because it's quite obvious at this stage that she's not going to run. And if you've heard any names of who could replace her.
Fernando?
I know that, thank you for the talk. I know you're going to say you don't know, but I want to know. Let's entertain us. Let's assume the opposition wins. What happens next?
Come to meta work.
Okay, one more.
So this is related to all of the questions, which is let's speculate a little bit about what happens in the world where we don't have Maduro or the regime. I wonder if what is it what people really want? Are we thinking that people are tired of like not having a democracy or a stable economy? And I'm trying to think about this in terms of like the rhetoric chosen by the opposition. Is it truly that what they're trying to get is more democracy, or is it the root problem, I mean, in the economics of Venezuela, rather than just the absence of free and fair elections? So I was just wondering, kind of like in thinking about how to unify, especially given the comments about how fractionalized the opposition is in terms of there's not a single project, at least in terms of economic policies.
Okay, guys, I know this is not fair, but try to keep your responses to a couple of minutes each. Javier.
Thank you. I just want to say that the most important question that Venezuela is facing right now is what Maria Corina Machado is going to do about whether to endorse a candidate or pretend that she's running or call for abstentionism. Maria Corina Machado has said that she's not going to step aside because that would be the equivalent of Maduro deciding who's running. I hope she changes her mind about that at some point. I do think that there are many examples of candidates who are proscribed in Latin American elections and in Venezuela, who nevertheless choose somebody to run because the idea is to support a movement, to support an end of a system. And I hope that that is what Maria Corina Machado is about. Now, I know that for the winner, and in this case, Maria Corina Machado, this is one of the hardest things to do. But, you know, Perón did it in 1973, and we just saw an example of something like that in the opposition in the state of Barinas. The government was proscribing a candidate, and they found someone until they finally were able to score. So let me just say about that. All these other questions are great, but let me just focus on how important it is for Maria Corina Machado to make the right decision here if the inhabilitación continues.
Sam.
There's some great questions. I'll just offer a couple very brief thoughts. In terms of the question of what is a reasonable goal for the opposition, I mean, I guess I think it just depends on what kind of election is held here. I personally, you know, like, basically, I'm not optimistic that a free election will be held, just because I think if I was looking at this from the perspective of the regime, there's just so much danger and there's so much uncertainty. But if for whatever confluence of factors, even a deeply unfair but basically free election was held, then I think your goal has to be to win. Like, I think they can win. And I think it's important not to give up on that goal. But I am not like super bullish on that context materializing. And I'm not saying like a democratic election, just basically an election where people are not prevented from voting, essentially, is the election, that the context that I would be looking for. And then the sort of the after Maduro question, you know, I think it's so complicated, but that a huge part of it really involves not just like democracy building or transition to democracy, but basically state building at this point, that there's just, you know, the sort of reconstruction of state authority across territory is a huge lift and going to be a big task for the next government. And, you know, you sort of do one thing at a time, but and the first thing we need to do is get the current regime out. But we also shouldn't, we should be realistic about just the size of the effort I think that's going to be necessary to sort of reconstruct Venezuela, unfortunately.
Thanks. Maryhen.
Okay, very briefly, a reasonable goal. It's a tough one, but I think getting back on track domestically would be really important, right? Remember that between 2019 and 2022, the focus was largely on external pressure, right? Maximum pressure to produce regime change. That didn't happen, and that weakened the opposition internally. So I think that focusing more on a local and regional development and kind of trying to rebuild organizational capacity beyond Caracas will be very important. I also think that this year will be important to build a stronger coalition that, you know, it's going to be very difficult to replicate the Mesa de Unidad Democrática, but something close to that would be important because there are going to be elections in 2025. Even if the opposition doesn't win in 24, for all the reasons that we have discussed, there are important elections coming up. And if it enters the loop again, after defeat, boycott, and then, right, we've known this, it's going to weaken it even more in the long term. So I think that the kind of re-emergence of the traditional opposition is important, kind of strengthening organizational capacity despite all the risks, right? And the commitment to democracy. So the question was also regarding that, whether the whole of the opposition wants democracy. I mean, I'm not sure about that question, but a reasonable goal would be that the more democratic opposition gets the upper hand in the next years to come. I also think that María Corina, for example, should be the first interested in party building, for example, and organizational capacity. Also looking ahead in 2025, I mean, she can be finally competitive in those elections. So it seems to me that the idea around party building and organizational capacity is the most reasonable goal for opponents. The question regarding civil society. So there are several things going on that are very interesting. First of all, I think what we're going to see maybe for next year is that from those civil society actors that have been working hard all these years, kind of like quietly, maybe there will be a push to participate in local regional elections, right? Because these actors have built local structures despite, you know, being weakened or unstable, but there are local leadership qualities that are very important. So that might occur in the future. And I think it's also interesting to understand the relationship between civil society and political parties regionally, as opposed to Caracas. Venezuela is a very centralized country where elites in Caracas have a different understanding of the country, and there isn't much interaction or coordination on a more equal level between civil society actors and political parties. That changes a little locally and regionally. So I'm thinking that maybe, you know, towards the future, it's hard to predict, but there can be changes in the way that those actors relate to one another, A. B, some actors from civil society maybe potentially will run. And thirdly, I think that civil society will continue to do the, you know, grassroots work, but not necessarily in political terms to mobilize, but more to alleviate the suffering of local communities.
Thanks. Francisco.
Yes, I just wanted to make a sort of a comment of what would be the scenario in which actually it could happen, that the opposition sort of wins because Maduro lets some sort of free elections to happen. I think that scenario looks sort of in the following outline. Maduro gets by doing the minimum to get the U.S. to renew the license. The Maduro gets some of this money and starts spending it significantly and gets his numbers a little bit up. The María Corina Machado supports another candidate, but it's not clear that the opposition is going to unite around that candidate because still, you know, Maduro has what we call the alacranes, you know, all the parties that are part of the system are the opposition that the government wants. Perhaps you have another candidate. I mean, the problem is that who is the candidate? Because Maryhen mentioned that a lot of people say, I will vote for whoever María Corina Machado says, or even for whoever is the candidate of the opposition. But when you put names instead of that general assumption, things get much more complicated. You know, if the candidate is Manuel Rosales, well, people are not going to vote for Manuel Rosales in the same numbers. If the candidate is X or Y, it's going to be difficult for the opposition to call it. So if Maduro believes, oh, maybe I can get by the traditional combination of abstention, thinking that the vote is not secret, dividing the opposition in three parts, then maybe I can get by, the way I want, and that requires his numbers to go up. And that's sort of the scenario in which he miscalculates. And it turns out that at the very last minute, the opposition coalesces into one candidate and he loses the election. I think I portrayed a difficult scenario, but that's the one I think we have to imagine to be optimistic. But the other question is, so what will that imply for a future? Let's say now the day after, how does the opposition govern? I think it depends a lot, as Maryhen said, on what type of person is this a person that can reduce the sort of the risk for the Chavismo, that because I don't see the military willing to give power to an opposition person that is very radical. It would be a very messy transition in any scenario. But I think the key is what political scientists always say: reducing the stakes of power, creating conditions for the Chavistas to feel that they can give up power. Otherwise, it would be a very, very messy transition, I think. And by the way, Steve, I have comments on the online questions, but if you want, I can give them right now or later. I have 2 comments of the online questions.
Why don't we hold off, because I think Fran has picked a question or 2.
Okay.
Just really quickly, just to reinforce a point Francisco made, and I completely agree with Javier that it's really important that Machado be willing to step aside if in the right strategic conditions. But the uncertainty that Sam highlighted at the beginning, the critical role of strategic electoral uncertainty in possibly triggering the kind of miscalculation that very often allows for transitions. If the regime knows it loses badly, Corina, a late substitution to an uncertain candidate dramatically increases the uncertainty in a way that could be quite positive, as Francisco alluded. We have very little time, but Fran is going to lead us to our lightning round.
Okay, we have 2 minutes. I'm gonna try to combine 3 questions into one in 20 seconds, and then 2 of you will have 30 seconds to answer. The questions are related to this electoral scenario, not the high-level scenario of who the opposition might put up, but looking at the electorate and looking at who to mobilize it. So we have a question about Venezuela being an organization that has not won a mayorship in 25 years and was able to elect only a couple of seats in the congressional elections of 2015, an election in which the opposition, as I've learned, won 109 seats. So so what do we do with this? If Venezuela doesn't seem to be able to, at least a few years ago, has not been able to mobilize a lot of votes. Other people have commented on the exodus of the better educated opposition, and so with the folks who are left in the rural areas, the folks who've suffered a decline in conditions. One question, Katrina Burgess asked how much those conditions have deteriorated in rural areas in recent years, and other people have asked sort of how that vote might swing. So again, if one of you can answer that question, it's now 1:19. That'd be great.
You can all take a quick swing at it, but it's got to be brief.
He's gonna teach. I could close, but he's gonna teach.
I'll just say one thing. I think in Latin America, to be a newcomer seems to be a political advantage in winning and a disadvantage in governing. Thank you.
Sam?
I don't have a great answer to actually either of those questions about Venezuela, or I mean, I think maybe others could speak better to the change in living conditions in rural areas. So I'll pass.
Okay.
I can mention something. It's very interesting what is happening, because Chavismo has tried to save sort of their electoral support in the major cities, in particularly in the city of Caracas, by providing better access to public services, including electricity. Whereas in the rural areas, the collapse of the economy has been catastrophic, except for one exception, which is the agricultural area around the state of Portuguesa. And so the problem, interestingly, that is changing. I mean, Chavismo, that the reason why they lost Barinas, you know, the home state of Hugo Chavez, is precisely because of how badly they have managed these rural areas. So I think that's a big problem. And I just wanted to mention, Michael Chifter asked me about the Trump thing. I think, you know, there are so many variations on what Trump could do in a second administration, you know, that go from being totally pragmatic and do business with Maduro on the oil side to, you know, a sort of a re-edition of the maximum pressure policy in a different way, of course, because we will not have an interim government. But Michael knows much more about this than I do. But I think I've seen signs of very different set of policies for the Trump administration. Thank you.
Tell Michael that by the end of a Trump administration, Venezuela may be helping to restore democracy in the United States. Maryhen, you have the last word.
Just very briefly, less than Francisco, only 20 seconds. I think the interesting part of the primaries, for example, showed that Maria Corina, being, you know, upper class Venezuelan, very privileged, was able to mobilize across sectors. So what we're seeing now is that poor communities and vulnerable groups are willing to vote against Chavismo despite the risks and despite the repression and because of the deteriorating living conditions. So I think there's a cross-cutting cleavage there. In fact, and then this may be for another seminar, I think that we're seeing more authoritarian attitudes in middle and upper classes and not necessarily in underprivileged groups. Thank you.
I need to close. Please do not show up next week because it's spring break. Please also join me in thanking our four wonderful panelists, Javier Corrales.
Thank you very much.